Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and with me again today I have Dr. Stephanie Buehler from California. She has done the podcast around infertility issues prior to this one, and today we're going to be talking about sexuality during pregnancy. And I know that, Stephanie, you're working on a book actually around some of these issues, which is so exciting because there doesn't seem to be a lot of information around some of these issues out there. So I'm excited to have this podcast with you today, and I'll let you introduce yourself briefly and we'll go from there.
First of all, thank you for having me on here and talking about this topic. You're right, there's not a lot out there on it. I had a number of midwives and psychotherapists asking me about this population, what happens to people during pregnancy. And I guess therapists and midwives and doulas, anyone that's helping couples during a pregnancy will get questions and they don't know how to answer them. So that's the purpose of the book. And what else about me? I have a private practice. I'm co-located with Womanology Restore Him, which is a pelvic floor clinic at Hoag, owned by Hoag Hospital here in Orange County. And I've written a textbook called What Every Mental Health Professional Needs to Know About Sex. And it's out in its second edition.
Wonderful. Yeah. And when do you expect this other book that you're working on to come out?
So my deadline is a little flexible, so we'll see. It will either be done sometime in May, June, or July, and I expect it to definitely be out by the end of 2017.
Okay, wonderful. And I'll just give the disclosure that we're both dealing with a little bit of raspiness and cold, so we're going to try to work with that as much as possible. Plus, you have a lovely bird in the background that every now and then.
I do. Yes, I have my lovely parrot, Bodhi, and he's been quiet all morning. And of course, you and I just talked for an hour and before we jumped into doing this podcast, and the bird was quiet. Now that we're being recorded,
he wants to be heard.
He wants to be on the podcast. So,
all right. So we'll try to edit him out as much as possible. But if you hear a chirp every now and then, you know what that is. I guess the framing I'd like to just start out with is right at the very beginning, as far as when a woman finds out she's pregnant and some of the changes that she'll notice in her body. And obviously that's going to affect not just her body, but her arousal and her desire. And I know I've spoken with many, many women over the years, and that could be quite spectrumed as far as what happens. So why don't we just start with the first trimester and have you speak to some of the things that start happening?
Right. So I think that's a really important comment that you just made, that there's quite a spectrum. So what I'm starting to conclude is if you've talked to one woman about pregnancy and sexuality, then you've talked to one woman about pregnancy and sexuality. Because it really is kind of all over the map. But there are some general patterns. And like you said, there are huge physical and psychological and emotional changes that begin to happen in the first trimester. And of course, the hormone levels of estrogen and progesterone and prolactin are all rising. And the rise in those hormones causes things like what we refer to as morning sickness, and what the medical literature refers to as emesis, which basically means kind of omitting or emitting things, puking, if you will.
Oh, and missing sounds so much lovelier than puking.
I know it does, and it sounds neat. And so we do have women with morning sickness, and A lot of what happens in the first trimester, as far as the relationship and sexuality goes, has to do with the severity of morning sickness. Some women feel absolutely horrible throughout that first trimester, and they're not good for much of anything. And other women go through this period very lightly and really don't have much trouble at all. So, of course, you can see why there would be more sexual activity for one couple and less for another. But there are other things that are starting to happen too. The breasts are starting to change a bit, and there's more starting to be just a little more blood flow to the pelvis. And the thing is that there's not too much of a change. Usually in the first trimester, couples continue to have sex as they did before the pregnancy, unless there is, like I said, a lot of morning sickness. For men, the pregnancy is not really real, or a lot of men. They're told that, hey, I'm pregnant, and it doesn't seem to, I don't want to say it doesn't mean too much to them, but I think, and what the research suggests is that not until the pregnancy is evident, not until they see the girth of the woman's abdomen growing, do they go, oh, there really is a baby. Wow.
There really is something coming here.
Right. Something is actually happening.
Well, and right. And I think I even remember feeling that way a little bit, like it was a bit surreal, like, oh, I'm pregnant and that's so nice, but you're kind of looking at yourself and you look the same. And other than some of these symptoms that you're talking about, like morning sickness, and I know a big one that a lot of women will have is fatigue, severely fatigued.
Yes.
I
Oh,
remember
yeah.
having to pull over from the road because I was falling asleep as I was driving, just like all of a
Right.
sudden, and never had that since being pregnant.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
so yeah, some of those symptoms that you kind of remind yourself, oh yeah, my body is changing, but it does seem that even for women, it's a little bit surreal until you start noticing some of the more, I guess, obvious signs.
Right. 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 And another, you said fatigue, which certainly I was only pregnant once. It was a long time ago, but I remember I was teaching elementary school and I would come home every day from teaching for that first trimester and just pass out. I was so tired. So that is certainly another symptom. And then, of course, frequent urination, which I think is kind of tiring. Like you're constantly running. Some women are constantly running to the bathroom, and those things, the fatigue, the morning sickness, the more frequent urination kind of add up to, I'm not feeling so sexy right now for some women. Now, others are not having that much of a symptom, and still others will find workarounds. They'll make sure that they get a nap, just take care of themselves as best they can so that they can maintain their sexual relationship. But that's kind of the first trimester.
And would you say that for some, there's even an increase in sexual desire or arousal?
That I haven't really seen in terms of research. But I'm certain that if there was a study with some qualitative research, that some couples would be so thrilled and happy about the pregnancy. Maybe it was something that they had planned and maybe needed to go to artificial means to accomplish a pregnancy, and maybe they felt very romantic about the whole thing. But I think that's kind of an exception. And again, men kind of from the get go, there are a number of men who don't want to have sex. They see the woman as being kind of fragile, and they will say, I don't want to hurt the baby. So you get that presentation right away. And interestingly, what I learned that I did not know is that in different cultures, not having sex during pregnancy is part of their religious or cultural belief. So, for example, I believe in Pakistan, you wouldn't have intercourse because it could cause preterm labor. And in Iran, and this was a recent article. I haven't seen this among the Iranian women that I treat here, but maybe in Iran, there's worry that if you had intercourse during pregnancy and you had preterm labor, they would consider that to be an abortion. And also that if you had a female fetus and you had intercourse, they have the idea that the hymen of the female fetus could be disturbed. And so these are kind of very interesting and very deep beliefs that some people have.
So, going back to some of the physiological changes in the first trimester that might get in the way, we're talking about obviously morning sickness, fatigue. You mentioned breast changes, which can lead to breast tenderness.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe nipple play or breast play that was pleasurable prior to pregnancy now is no longer pleasurable, or at least more sensitive. You have to wait until the woman is more aroused or is more ready for that type of stimulation. You also mentioned blood flow to the pelvis. Does that change anything as far as labial or clitoral readiness for sexuality as well?
Yes. So this is more in the second trimester. And, one of the things I have to say in reading the research, it was pointed out that a lot of the research is done through recollection. So women talking about their experiences. And do women, or does anyone accurately remember exactly when in a 9-month period one's desire dropped or got better, or, not really. So, these are a little bit arbitrary in terms of understanding sexuality. So do keep that in mind. But in the second trimester, there is more blood flow to the pelvis. And interestingly, some women will have their first orgasm during this period because with all that blood flow, the clitoris gets erect more easily, and that allows more stimulation. And so there you have it. Some women will have multiple orgasms for the first time during the second trimester of pregnancy. So that's a happy consequence of being pregnant. On the other hand, some women find everything just as more irritated. They don't find the stimulation so pleasurable. Like it's too much, like you said. And sort of like with breasts, the breasts can kind of grow to capacity, and that can make the breasts very uncomfortable. And so some women really don't want to be touched all that much during the second trimester. And I'm guessing for some couples, this is very problematic. The man still has desire, and she's over there going, I got nothing. I don't want to be touched. I want to be bothered with this. And so they're going to have to negotiate things out and figure things out. Whereas sometimes you have the woman who feels lusty. She feels like, wow, look at my boobs. They're great. This is awesome. There can even be a fascination with the genitals. Wow, look, they've changed. Everything's changed. I'm so full and lush. And I'm really into this. And I feel really horny or randy. And you know what? The husband might be like, I don't think that pregnant belly and those boobs, they're not that sexy to me. I'm not too interested. Maybe there's a psychological piece. Man could be kind of intimidated by the whole thing or worried about the whole thing, or he may have some very complex feelings about becoming a father, complex feelings about having become pregnant, especially if the pregnancy wasn't planned. So there's a lot going on there in that second trimester, and I think it's a very individual thing. Masters and Johnson did some research. I think they may have been the first to do any research on couples' sexuality during pregnancy, and they said that there was not too much sex going on in that first trimester, more in the second trimester because there was this kind of erotic fascination with the pregnant body and, easier arousal. And then not much in the third trimester. But actually, not all subsequent studies really support that. And in general, you find a decline from the first trimester to the third trimester. It really doesn't go, nothing going on first, then lots, then nothing going on at the end. It just kind of declines over time.
Going back to even the first trimester changes, when you talk about the hormonal piece and estrogen and all of these different hormones rising, we also see some emotional changes for the woman. So just like we sometimes notice emotional moodiness or different pieces happening during different parts of the cycle, of the menstrual cycle, I think we also see this in pregnancy as well. So do you want to talk about some of the more psychological or emotional, relational things that might happen due to hormonal changes?
Definitely. Again, some women feel their absolute best while they're pregnant. Those are the women I stare at and go, really? They just feel like my skin is glowing, my hair is thick, I'm pumped full of hormones. I feel awesome.
They tend to have these beautiful basketball bellies, is what I call them,
right?
instead of like becoming large all over like I did.
Yes, right. Oh, yes. I ate so many chocolate-covered graham crackers. I'm surprised I didn't turn into one during my pregnancy, but it's a good thing I didn't. Anyway, so, but other women, I think it's emotions, but it's also, some of that is fueled by, of course, more estrogen, which is what makes us kind of labile around the time of menstruation. But a lot of it has to do with body image, and really about half, and that seems to be rather consistent across studies, about half of women have a negative body image during the pregnancy and don't like looking at themselves. Like you said, you can gain weight everywhere. You can look in the mirror and go like, ugh, I don't look like me. I mean, I've seen references to, and I have heard women say, I feel like something has taken over my body, like you don't have control, especially for women who maybe are athletic and feel like they have a lot of control over not just how their body looks, but how it functions. So if they're a runner or something like that, they have certain ideas about just their body and how they're in touch with it and what they do to keep it in good health and all of this. And then they realize that there are sort of like alien forces is how they would express it in their body that's making all of these changes that they don't themselves dictate. So that can be very kind of weird and distressing for women. It is kind of interesting. I came across one researcher, I can't remember the name, unfortunately, but she talked about something kind of opposite, which is the syndrome of the, she called it the yummy mummy, kind of like the sexual mom. So back in the 90s, we had Demi Moore when that famous Vanity Fair photo bearing her naked pregnant belly. And that was right. That was the most controversial cover that Vanity Fair had ever published, and one of the most commented on of all time. So people had very different reactions to seeing a mother as being, some saw it as like a very pure expression of motherhood, and others projected that it was gross and disgusting because it was saying a pregnant woman could be a sexual being. And then others still projected that, yes, of course, women who are pregnant are still sexual beings. They still want, some of them really feel sexy and want to engage in sex. And it's kind of interesting. I kind of looked into that cover a little bit. And Demi Moore herself said she didn't understand what all the fuss was about. She just felt like, here I am, okay, let's take a picture of me. I'm pregnant. let's take a picture of my belly. And that was kind of it. But there were all of these projections. And so people have different ideas. So women have different ideas. They bring different ideas with them as they go into the pregnancy about whether being pregnant is sexy or not. And of course, long ago, like when I wore maternity clothes, it looked like maternity clothes. I mean, it was a tent. I remember I had a jumper, a denim jumper, because I was a teacher, so that's why I wore a denim jumper. 3 days a week, like in between, I was washing it, and it was huge. And I saw a picture of myself, and I went like, "Wow! I didn't know I could ever look that big." And then today, women are kind of proud to show off their baby bump. And so that's where that idea of the yummy mummy comes from. Look at me. I look all nice and juicy with my baby bump, and I'm going to show it off. So attitudes have kind of changed about sexuality and pregnant women. I think it's something that people maybe are grappling with privately. Nobody talks about it. When I see a woman really showing off her baby bump, I don't go, "Ooh, hot mama." I don't know if she's thinking hot mama. I don't know if she's thinking hot mama or, hey, you know what? I'm pregnant. I'm so happy. I'm going to show it to the world. I'm not sure. So this is kind of an unresolved part of women's sexuality, I think.
Well, and there's a long history of shaming women who were pregnant. You wouldn't be able to keep your job because it was kind of, oh my goodness, we're going to look at a pregnant woman every day, or,
right.
or
because it was evidence that you'd had
right, back in the 50s and 40s. I know that there's a long history of that. And then just going back in time, this idea that pregnant women oftentimes have been hidden away, or there was a time of reprieve, where they would kind of disappear from society.
Right.
Yeah, nobody wanted to look at this, indiscreet type of feminine symbol of fertility, which, even goes back to the mother whore complex, right? That we traditionally talk about in religious circles, where you have the Virgin Mother, the one that we idolize and adore, and religions, even, Catholic religion really worships her, prays to her, and you didn't need sex, right, for that.
Right.
And and so I think it is hard for women to, with all the different messages around modesty and how you present yourself. And I mean, we already have a lot of that, even without being pregnant, is this idea of how we present ourselves, whether or not we're sexual enough, how we feel about ourselves, how other people feel about ourselves. And now added to that is this manifestation that I'm with child, which is very much a connotation of I've had sex. And really interesting psychological plays there, like you mentioned, for both the male and the female. I see a lot of women retreat into more of a domestic type of aura. They'll wear not to shame anybody around these things, but I'll notice a lot of times they'll wear the Mickey Mouse shirts and the jumpers and the kind of non-sexual, even after, having a baby, like during the child years, they'll present as very mommy-ish versus having more of a personal style. And men too. And I think even in other cultures, I know in the Latin culture I come from, there's a big tradition, maybe not so much again today, but as little time as 40 years ago, it was very common to have a mistress, because you wouldn't want to defile the mother of your children with your sexuality. You might procreate with her, but she's this fragile or sacred or special vessel that you don't want to defile with your own sexual fantasies or desires or pleasures. And so you find some other woman to carry that stuff out with.
Right. And then on the other hand, you do have men who find a pregnant woman very sexy. Those are big boobs, and wow, look at your clitoris and look how big it's getting. And yes.
There might be women also who find women.
Well, you know what? That's so, Natasha, that's something I actually posted on Facebook, which I said, hey, I'm writing this book, and there is nothing about the sexuality of lesbian couples when they're pregnant. Nothing. So we don't know. I don't know. I don't know what happens. It might be very complex. It might be the same, where some women are excited to see their partner pregnant, and some women are excited to be pregnant, and all of that. But so far, I haven't really come across much in that regard. So, and then men have to think about themselves too in terms of like being a father and being sexual. I think some of that probably depends on what was role modeled for them, in their home growing up. I mean, did their father treat their mother like with kid gloves, or at arm's distance, or did they have a lusty relationship? And so he could see, oh, you know what? You can love up and have sex with the mother of your children. Or do you see something else modeled, like you referred to? Nope, that's not cool. And I think that we have these little things that people say that kind of get them out of things without having to have a conversation. And one of those things I think that men sometimes say is, I don't want to hurt the baby. I don't want to hurt the baby. For some men, I suspect, is I think it's kind of gross to have sex with my wife while she's pregnant. So I'm not going to do that. And I'm going to say it's because of the baby.
Like code speaks, I'm not hurting your feelings. I don't want to let you know that I don't find you as attractive or that I'm kind of weirded out by your pregnant body. And so I'll come up with something else.
Yes, I figured out that one of my clients was on the spectrum. It's something that I suspected, it was somebody on the autism spectrum. Told his wife when she was 7 months pregnant that he just absolutely didn't find her attractive at all, and he couldn't understand why she was so upset. And we talked about that emotionality that women have, and I said, really? I said, if we went out onto the mall, down the road, and we went up to 100 men and said, would you tell your wife when she's 7 months pregnant that you found her unattractive? How many of them do you think would say, no way, I don't want to get killed, right? So he kind of looked at me like, really?
Right. He's just being honest with his feelings.
I'm just being honest. I'm going, oh my God, if my husband had said that to me, oh, there would have been hell to pay. So I think men know. They already see maybe a woman that's going like, wow, my body's weird. This is kind of weird. This whole thing is weird. And then he's going to add to it by saying, you're right. You really don't look so attractive while you're pregnant.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard because a lot of those things happen without intention. They just kind of happen. We have these feelings, we have these thoughts, we can't really control our erotic template that way. And yet we want to be cognizant of each other's feelings and not offend. And so it does start getting complicated as far as how you start talking honestly about some of these issues and hopefully have some humor in the process.
Right, to have some humor in the process or to be empathic. So if a comment is made, it slips, like you said, things slip out sometimes. So if the comment is made or it slips out, to really take ownership and be empathic and apologize and be sensitive to your partner. But these are things that do come up.
One of the things that I really kind of look at when I see a couple who's coming in, they've maybe been married 10 years or 15 years, and I go back and do the assessment of their timeline. I'm always curious as to when they got pregnant, especially in Mormon culture. Many people don't necessarily wait to get pregnant, so they'll get married. And oftentimes in Mormon culture, people have had short courtships. We're not really proponents of premarital sex, and so it's not that uncommon to have known somebody for 3 to 6 months and be married within that time or even within the year of knowing each other. And now we're getting married and having sex for the first time, and many people get pregnant. We talk about the honeymoon babies, or they get, pregnant within the first 6 months of their marriage. And this emotional component that we're talking about, where so much is happening hormonally for the woman, And of course, things happen after pregnancy, and then oftentimes Mormon women are having more than one baby. So you may go 10 or 15 years in a marriage where you've been kind
Yes.
of consistently pregnant every, year and a half to 3 years, and
Yes.
your body hasn't really had a chance to recalibrate back to what we'd call a pre-pregnancy state. And you might be married to a woman who's been hormonally in flux since the time you pretty much met
Right.
her.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so I kind
that's
of tease
true.
the couple that you may not really know who you're married to quite yet, because so many things
Uh,
have been in play with child, just a huge effort and time and
yes.
fatigue and hormonal shifts and body changes that
Oh,
happen
yes.
with child rearing.
Yes. Oh, yes. You know what? Yes. Certainly, I've worked with Mormon couples, but what I've seen is in the Latino culture is couples that have known each other like 2 or 3 months, and they had premarital sex. They get pregnant right away, and they marry right away. So I've had a number of clients who have come in with that presentation, and that's very, very difficult way to start a relationship. And what they will say is, we never had a chance to have a normal kind of getting to know you, exploration or exploratory kind of sexuality with each other. So that's a very interesting way that people have a start to their marriage or their relationship. And of course, sometimes pregnancies are really unplanned. Lots of pregnancies are unplanned. I forget what the statistic is, but it's rather high.
I would
And
guess it's higher than the planned ones.
right, so couples have to get their head around that. Like you, when I talk to people about when things went off track, it's more often in the postpartum period, and so we can talk about that in another podcast maybe. But things do sometimes get off track right there during the pregnancy, and those couples that have very little sexual contact, you do have to worry about them a bit. Most couples they may not be having frequent sex. They may not be having intercourse either. They may be having other types of sexual contact, but they're having contact, whether it's cuddling together or fondling one another, fondling each other's genitals, or whatever it is that they're doing. They're having some kind of contact. And those couples that do not or did not, you have to worry about. Well, one of the things that does happen for women, unfortunately, is that there can be more sex can be more painful starting in the second trimester, and it can more women in the third trimester can have painful intercourse because of changes in the structure of the pelvis, of the vagina, the pelvic floor muscles, and just find intercourse very unpleasant. And so you can see that they might be avoiding any kind of sexual contact altogether. So that's kind of an important thing to know about the experiences that women have, and to talk to couples about any problems that they had during the pregnancy. Of course, some women need to be on bed rest or avoid having intercourse for a number of reasons. Maybe there's been bleeding or some leakage of amniotic fluid. I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't want to speak too much about that. But in those cases, a couple has to I think it's important for the couple to have a frank and open conversation about how they're going to manage through that time.
Right. So that we have strategies in place where the male in particular doesn't feel like he has to go on some type of sexual or ejaculation hiatus, but the woman doesn't feel like she's got all this pressure upon her either, especially if her body isn't cooperating with her desire to be sexual.
Right. And, it's unfortunate that there is a risk of affairs happening during pregnancy. And supposedly this happens in something like 7 to 23% of couples, that the husband will have an affair during pregnancy. And it could be for a number of reasons. We don't want to just point to, oh, he's not getting his sexual needs met. It can also be, not dealing with fears about becoming a father. It could be a trigger of mental illness like bipolar disorder from the stress and strain of the idea of becoming a father. It could be feeling left out and not getting emotional attention. So, these are all things that can happen during a pregnancy. I think it's important for mental health professionals to include, when couples come in and they say that they have children, to ask about the pregnancy and see if everything went as one would expect. I have been personally and professionally rather amazed at how many calls I get, like even a month, 3 or 4 weeks after a woman has given birth, saying, we need to get in there now, as things are really bad between us, and it has to do with our sex life. And, sometimes the sex life wasn't great before the pregnancy, and it was awful during. And, it's usually the man is saying, you know what, I'm going to blow a fuse here because my sexual needs are not being met. I've also had couples coming in who want to fix their sex life before they get pregnant. And maybe you've seen that too. Couples say that our sex life is not what we want it to be, and we want to have a family, or I want, maybe one wants to have the family. Often it's the female partner, but we're so afraid our sex life is going to deteriorate from what it is that we don't want to become pregnant. So this is a very critical time, maybe the most critical time in an adult life, because you're changed, you're forever changed. Once you become a parent, you can't undo it. Right. So your identity is forever changed. And, I have a 25-year-old daughter, and I feel like, well, I'm still parenting. Not much, not a lot, but still a parent.
Right.
And so it's a huge, 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 huge deal. And, we kind of have assumptions that any couple in a committed relationship is going to be happy and have bluebirds flying around their house. Like a Disney film, bows being tied and all of that, and whistling happening, and I don't think that's that's not true. I think during pregnancy, some couples really have unresolved conflicts that come up, fears about loss of freedom and what it's going to mean for their relationship or themselves. A very complex time.
Well, even going to some of the gender roles that can happen typically is that it seems like a lot of women start bonding with the baby during pregnancy. They can feel the baby kick starting in the second trimester and move, and the husband can, or the partner can feel sometimes that through the stomach, but it's a much more, I think, visceral connection that the mother has carrying the child. And there's, typically for most women, there's a lot of bonding that happens, especially right after the child is born, that we don't necessarily see in the research happen for men as much as in the toddler years, when the child can start actually being more interactive with the father.
Yeah.
So we see more of the bonding happening there. Again, this is all very heteronormative, stereotypical type of scenarios.
Yeah.
And it's also, I think, tied to breastfeeding. I know that a lot of fathers tend to bond quite a bit when they bottle feed. So it's not, again, this is kind of stereotypical. But I think it goes to some of this, if there is a sexual problem or disconnection, a complaint that often comes from the male partnership is that I'm being replaced. Now, all of this attention and affection and even physical touch, the caresses of the new baby and the loving and the holding of the new baby, like you get a lot of your physical needs met through babying. I know that there was a time when I remember, this is probably TMI, I'm going to share several TMI moments here, but I remember lying in my bed and feeling like, my husband wanted one boob and my child wanted another boob, and there was like nothing left of me.
Nobody gets a boob.
I was like, everybody get off my boobs. But you don't reject your child usually, right? You don't say, well, no, you can't have me because I'm tired. You prioritize the needs of that baby, whereas you are very much expecting your spouse to understand that you're fatigued or tired or sore or all those things. And that can feel, maybe intellectually the husband makes sense of that, but emotionally it can feel like a very lonely time.
Yes, definitely. The research bears this out. And again, there's not too much, but men definitely feel left out. And from what I have read, it really isn't about sex. It isn't about, your belly is so big that it's awkward to have sex. It's really more about not getting attention. And I just think about going to the first ultrasound with my husband. You know what? Nobody talked to him, right? Everybody's talking to me. I think so often that healthcare providers, if the man is along, I don't know that they always smile and say, "How are you doing?" you know, they're just supposed to kind of man up maybe and go along for the ride. I think that men have a lot of feelings about becoming a father, and they don't like to express them because they think that they're supposed to be kind of a tower of strength during this time for their partner, or to show that to society. But I think often they have very real fears. Often they are financial. It is kind of stereotypical. How am I going to provide? Even if the couple is both working, I do hear this, that the father will feel a heightened sense of responsibility about his financial contribution to the family, and that causes a lot of stress and strain. There are a lot of groups for moms after the baby comes. There's MOPS, and there's, Mommy and Me, and there's a lot of like swimming with the baby and all of this. There's not too much for fathers. There's not, you don't hear fathers saying, "I can't wait to take the baby to swim lessons," the way you hear moms saying that. Mom is already fantasizing, I think, all the things that she's going to be doing with the baby because it's all there for her and the baby. But for fathers, what is there? It's like, what is my role? Who am I supposed to be? I think it leads to men feeling resentful sometimes, maybe some depression. And of course, we haven't talked about depression during pregnancy for women either. That certainly can be a factor in not feeling much in the way of desire. Men have feelings too, as we learn in therapy.
Can you talk about some of the statistics or rates around depression for women during pregnancy?
You know what? I don't have off the tip of my tongue. I don't. I know that, some women go into pregnancy with a history of depression. I know that they have to be followed very carefully and by a psychiatrist. There are a lot of psychiatrists that will not follow a woman during her pregnancy if she is on SSRIs. I happen to work at Hoag, which has one of the very few psychiatrists. She calls herself a reproductive psychiatrist, and she does take care of women during pregnancy who have been depressed or bipolar or have some other psychiatric problem. The thing is, again, because the stereotype is that if a woman is pregnant, she is supposed to put on, be happy. And so she may put on a happy face and not talk about what she's actually going through. That's problematic.
I see that a lot in our Mormon culture because there's such an emphasis on the role of women and motherhood, and something that we're supposed to look forward to, and something that's going to be a big part of our identity as Mormon women. And when that doesn't fit, boy, that can be really, really discombobulating for so many women. both,
Yeah.
during pregnancy and after. Like I said, most women might bond, but there are women who don't feel like they're bonding with their infant or don't feel attached to the fetus as it's growing, and that can be very, very disconcerting.
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Doing a sex therapy, my practice is exclusively sex therapy now, but before I learned sex therapy, I had many women coming in during their pregnancy feeling depressed. Often, what was interesting for me is often they had a mother who had a psychiatric illness, anything from depression to schizophrenia. And of course, a very sad fact is that how many women have been sexually abused. And so it's not so much the pregnancy, it's often labor and delivery that bring up a lot of fears around pain and the reproductive system. So these are very complex kinds of issues. And women, that's the thing. Women need not feel ashamed or that they are the only one who has ever felt a certain way about their body, about the pregnancy, about labor and delivery, and what they are fear is going to life is going to be like afterwards. That they really need to talk to somebody to find a good listening ear, and whether that's a therapist or the gynecologist, the midwife, somebody in clergy, is not to keep this stuff bottled up.
And to make sure you're talking to somebody who isn't minimizing those concerns or saying things like, well, just accept your role and move on.
Right, right. Yes, right. Or it will be all better when the baby comes. Whoa.
Right. Promise it's not able to follow through. Yeah. And
Right.
even I think husbands, like I see a lot of Mormon men who are very excited about being fathers because there is a huge identity in fatherhood as well in Mormonism. And if they are married to a woman who isn't having that same excitement, that can be very confusing. This is what I thought we were signing up for together,
Yeah.
and this is what I thought we were excited to do together. And if she's all of a sudden depressed or not bonding with her child, that can be extremely disconcerting for the husband as well,
Oh,
especially if he's looking forward to it.
oh, yeah, yeah. Very, and he becomes depressed, right? So that's very problematic. But fortunately, the fortunate thing is that most couples are actually okay. I would say, at least 50, 60% of couples continue to have sex life throughout the entire pregnancy, and that there are couples that even will have intercourse, like 2 weeks before delivery, and they found a position that works for them. So, but it's worth going into this and checking in with a couple as part of their history. You're talking about, especially if you're a sex therapist and you're talking about sexuality as being apart from the reproductive system, I think that's a mistake. I think we do have to think about the whole gamut of what it means to be a sexual being. And I think in our modern age, with the advent of birth control, that we not lose sight, but we kind of forget that everything is interconnected.
Okay, so I know we're nearing the end here, and I want to cover two topics here at the end. So one is, let's just go over some of the myths that tend to be pretty common. You mentioned some of them at the very beginning. So can a man hurt the baby if he's having intercourse? Because that's not always said out of just trying to avoid sex. Some people, I think, really believe that or are worried about that. Can the baby see my penis coming in? Right?
Oh, yes, right.
There's that question. Will it cause preterm labor? Will it cause me to start contracting if I have sex? So these are just some of the things that you mentioned. And so let's talk about those and any others that you can think of that kind of regularly come up.
Sure. So Are there instances where having intercourse or having an orgasm can cause preterm labor? The answer is yes, but that's rare. There was not a lot of studies on it, amazingly. The one study that was done in China showed that women in the last trimester, something like 6% of them had had intercourse, and that seemed to trigger labor. But they weren't all in the latter part of the pregnancy. And it wasn't that the infant was born prematurely, it was just, a little earlier than expected. And of course, the gestation, I mean, it's always an estimate, right? So who knows? Who knows how accurate it is in other countries? Not always accurate here. So the fact is that the baby is floating in that nice cushion of amniotic fluid, and that there's a big thick plug of mucus in the cervix, and the chance of intercourse causing preterm labor is very low. And I think most any doctor, unless there's a reason to worry, any doctor will say it is safe. However, having said that, if I had a client in front of me and they were worried about it, I would absolutely tell them, have a conversation with your physician and ask your physician if it is safe, and follow what your physician says. So that's what I have to say about that. The other is, can the baby see the penis? The answer is no. Does the baby know that you're having sex? No, the baby's senses aren't fully developed. How the baby doesn't know what sex is. How are they going to know what is happening?
The movement of sex might put the baby to sleep, just like when the mother is moving for any reason.
Right, yeah, that's true. So we don't know. And, no baby has come out and said, you know what? I know you did the deed while I was in the uterus. So I think the thing is, too, that most people think they don't like specifically to think about their parents having sex per se, but they do like the idea that their parents loved each other during a pregnancy. And so, I can't imagine why anyone would think that there's something wrong with having sex during or having intercourse. And then for couples that really don't want to have intercourse, I mean, that's whether it has to do with attraction or whatever it is, that doesn't mean that you have to refrain from all sexual activity. You can have all kinds of different outer course if you'd like, oral sex or manual sex, using toys and all of that. That's all fine.
What about the question, like, I somewhat well endowed, or I'm long and I'm going to hit up against her cervix and cause damage, something along those lines, or hurt her?
If there hasn't been any cervical pain during intercourse before, I don't see why there would be during the pregnancy. But I think that's one I would refer to the physician and talk to the physician about that. The other thing is to use some kind of a donut, like a latex donut at the base of the penis to make it shorter, or essentially shorter, and not to use missionary position, because maybe side by side or spooning position, so that there's not so much depth of penetration.
Any type of lube concerns while pregnant?
Recently I read something on lubrication during pregnancy, and it said all kinds of lubrication are safe. I think most sex therapists will say that they have a preference for not using anything with glycerin in it, but to use silicone-based or water-based lubricant. And of course, using coconut oil seems to be very popular these days. I wouldn't use just any kind of oil. It seems that coconut oil seems to be well tolerated, and no problem using it.
What about I want to speed up now? I'm in my 42-week period or 40-week period and or 38-week period, and now I want to speed things up. So I'm going to have sex so that we start labor.
I haven't gotten to there yet in my
as far as your research.
I'm on pregnancy. So I really plan to dig into that and see about that myth and whether or not it's true. I mean, I've certainly heard it. I've had couples tell me that they did it to induce labor, and some have. Again, as long as there's no pain, you don't want to do missionary position in the last trimester of the pregnancy, because that is something where the man can do some harm by putting his weight on the uterus. And also, it's not good for the mom to have all of that weight. If she's just lying flat on her back, that's not so good for her either. But I would imagine, and I don't know, does it have to be intercourse? Can it be just having an orgasm, for example? Maybe that induces labor. One thing that I came across, however, is that sometimes towards the end of pregnancy, because there is so much blood running to the pelvis and the genitals, that there can be kind of congestion of blood. That blood does not flow back out of the genitals, of the woman's genitals, after having an orgasm or sexual activity. That can be kind of irritating or uncomfortable. And also that some women with an orgasm toward the end of pregnancy will just have like one long kind of uncomfortable clenching in the pelvic area and around the uterus. So just something to be aware of and pay attention to.
Well, and I will just again share some TMI about. I had 4 children, 4 pregnancies. All of them were somewhat the same and somewhat different, as far as details of that. But it was interesting for me as I entered the second trimester and even the first part of the third trimester, even though I was one that was not happy with my body image, my sexual desire went up highly. So I would just, I guess, call myself very horny during those times. I didn't care what I looked like. I was like, let's just get this done because I need this outlet or something. That came crashing down after having the babies, and especially during my breastfeeding times. So that's my personal experience. And I know as I've talked to hundreds of women about this, that again, we want to remind people there's that spectrum.
Yes,
Some
right.
women will have very little desire all throughout their pregnancy. Some women will have desire peaks throughout their pregnancy at different times.
Yes.
And then afterwards, again, we're going to do the third podcast about after sexuality after pregnancy. So we'll talk more about that. But the hormonal fluctuations, again, are shifting at all times during those weeks.
Yeah. Yes. And so it makes it all very confusing because, we don't tend to, as a society, talk about sexuality and pregnancy, but I think it's actually, it's something, it's like the whole pregnancy in some ways is just a period of adjustment and getting through to the goal of having a healthy child. But it's a emotionally very trying time for people, and sexually can be a trying time. And if people have information such as what you just said, that women may be on a spectrum, with some having no desire or very little desire and some having peaks of desire during the pregnancy, and that one isn't better than the other. It's just what's normal for you. And then also, how are you going to negotiate this with your partner? How are you going to communicate about this so that you both feel understood, which I think is always the most important part of communication.
Yeah. Which is where I want to kind of leave off is, so what are some recommendations we have? And you've been kind of giving them all along. But one I would say is pregnancy is probably not the best time to attribute a lot of meaning to whatever is happening. I think that we get into meaning ruts in general with sexuality, like, oh, well, you don't want me, or you don't love me, or you don't prioritize me, or I'm too sexual, or you're not sexual enough. Like all these meanings that we kind of project onto ourselves and to each other as we negotiate sexuality as a couple, which is already a difficult thing. So I would just encourage people to not necessarily see the pregnancy time as a time where you're going to attribute a lot of meaning to what is happening.
Right. I think that is very wise, that to attribute a lot of what's happening to hormonal changes and also to emotional changes. I mean, some women do become more self-absorbed during a pregnancy. They just kind of turn inward with the whole thing. It doesn't mean that she loves her partner any less, and it doesn't necessarily mean that she's depressed either. So I think the most important tip, as always, is good communication about what's going on, to seek out information, talk to a doctor, talk to a therapist who knows a lot about this part of our human development. I would say be open to non-penetrative types of sex, and not even sex, to be open to cuddling and affection, and to say, you know what, that's where we are at right now as a couple, that we need to hug and caress each other and tell each other that everything's going to be fine, and this is a good thing that is happening to us and to our relationship, and give each other reassurance. And I think, in the end, if there are any concerns about safety, talk to your doctor. And I always say, if you have a doctor that you don't feel you can talk to about these things, it may be time to find another doctor, because you want a doctor where you can bring up issues around your sexuality. That's part of your overall health.
And I would totally second the outer course idea. It's such a shame that we tend to see successful sex as vaginal penile sex in our culture. And there's lots of wonderful ways, whether you have an orgasm or not, whether or not somebody ejaculates, whether or not there's vagina being penetrated, that you can have wonderful sex and really enjoy each other's bodies, and just the reality of the changes that your bodies are going through during that time.
Yep.
Love that advice. And I think that that's exactly what I wanted to get out of you today.
Okay. Awesome.
I think that's wonderful. Are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
I would say that, sometimes we have things going on within ourselves and with our body that are confusing and that we don't understand, and that we have to be gentle with ourselves during those times, not blame it on others, and just accept that things are ambiguous or ambivalent or weird, and just go like, well, this is certainly an interesting time, and maybe in a week or two or a month or two, I'll have perspective and I'll understand it better.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for coming on. This was a wonderful podcast, and I hope people will find it really useful. It's a time, I think, where information is so needed and normalization is needed, and just people feeling like they've got somebody who's got their backs. So thank you so much.
Oh, you are welcome. Thank you for having me.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too. But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary love.